Okay, boys and girls, we are on. We are live. Welcome to On the Morrow. And today we are going to learn a fascinating piece of Gemara. It took me a long time to figure this out today, because on the surface, it just seems like a repetition. And one of the interesting things that we're going to do in this class is demonstrate how there's certain parts of Torah that cannot be understood without the mystical and spiritual dimension. In other words, if you only look at things in a literal way, and the Torah, of course, must be viewed in a literal way, the Torah talks to us in literal terms. And the ideas of Torah have to be carried out in real time. Chas v'shalom, if anybody suggests that the Torah is just concepts and ideas that are not applicable to everyday or real life, that's heresy. And that's beyond the pale. However, if somebody thinks that the Torah is only limited to the technicalities and the function of performing the technical mitzvahs, they're making a very big mistake. And sometimes, because the Torah is comprised, like all of us, of body and soul, and there's something called nigla de Torah, the revealed area of the Torah, and the hidden area of Torah, the mystical or esoteric teachings of Torah, as the Rebbe pointed out many times, some things can only be understood by virtue of delving into eponymous HaTorah, the esoteric discipline. And this is perhaps one of those examples. I, for one, do not have a good explanation outside of the spiritual realm for the subject we're going to talk about tonight, which is on the morrow. On the morrow of Shabbat, you should begin to count. That's what the Torah says. Mimacharat HaShabbat. And we have spent the better part of the last 5 episodes trying to prove that on the morrow of Shabbat means on the second day of Pesach. And Shabbat is not to be understood as the 7th day of the week, or what we call the Sabbath, but rather the first day of Yom Tov, which we celebrate by ceasing work and by behaving in a different fashion. So that cessation of work is a Shabbat of sorts. So there's Shabbat that can refer to all the festivals, and then there's what we call Shabbat Bereshit. And in our previous episode, we highlighted the words of the Rashbam, and that's found in Masechet Bava Basra and Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph, and we also talked about the commentary of the Rosh, which is found in Masechet Nedarim, where we explain why it's called Shabbat Bereshit and how it links back to the 6 days of creation by God that enabled us to have the 7th day sanctified by God. And by virtue of this, Reb Tzadok HaKohen said, we can have the sanctity of Shabbat always. That's very nice. That's very nice. And that's why we call it Shabbat Bereshit as well. However, who are you fooling? Everybody knows that when you say Shabbat, you're talking about the 7th day of the month. When you say Yom Tov, you're talking about the days of Pesach or Sukkot, or for that matter, Shavuot, the entirety of Shavuot, and Rosh Hashanah, where we don't do normative work. It's called Yom Tov. In fact, it's called Hilchos Yom Tov, the laws of Yom Tov. And the laws of Yom Tov, as the Rambam tells us, are one. It's all the same halachot. They're not separate halachot. Observing Pesach and Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, and Sukkot, or Shmini Atzeret, are all identical. In the Shulchan Aruch, it's called Hilchos Yom Tov. It's not called Hilchos Shabbos. So at the end of the day, it's almost like, so why did the Torah call it Mimacharat HaShabbat? Why didn't the Torah just say Mimacharat HaChag or B'yom HaSheni? I mean, something straightforward. Now, in the previous episodes, we richly illustrated that it isn't by virtue of these limudim. It's not by virtue of this delving into and the analysis of the verses and the investigation of what they might mean that we come to the conclusion that, in fact, we're talking about the second day of Pesach. This is a tradition, and it goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu, and we know it's true. And we can find it in the Torah too. Okay. And it's proven beyond the shadow of a doubt. Because even though the Gemara is going to question that many of the proofs are not as nearly as ironclad as they seem, when you have the whole cacophony of different symphonies, and they're all playing the same tune, and all the arrows are pointing in the same direction, then it becomes abundantly clear that yes, this must be the second day of Pesach. But you'll see that precisely because today we're going to emphasize the idea of Mimacharat HaShabbat. And in all of the limudim that we are going to cover today, we're going to be emphasizing the concept of Shabbat and the distinction of the 7th day of the week, and how that becomes extremely difficult to kind of fit into the first day of Yom Tov, then we're gonna try to answer that big question. Okay, so why? Like, what was the Torah trying to tell us? But that's going to come at the end of the class. So we're going to start at the very bottom of Daf Samach Hey Amud Beis. The photocopies that I made for you start on Daf Samach Vav Amud Aleph on page 66, because really the Gemara is going to be focused on Daf Samach Vav. The very last line of Daf Samach Hey, the very last line of page 65 in the Gemara, just records a name. But this is going to be a big issue, the name, because we have heard this name before. And I'm going to take you back a couple of episodes. Actually, for your benefit, it's the last episode of last year's classes, right? Because every year we return to Tractate Menachot, we're learning about Sefirat. So you might not remember this, but a year ago, we learned the first of these teachings. After we learned about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we began to speak about the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer. And then we went on to speak about the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and now we're mentioning Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira again, and he's saying something else. And that's going to be strange. So the Tosfos has a big question about that. But I'm going to ask an even more obnoxious question. I shouldn't say more. I'm going to ask an obnoxious question. The Tosfos is going to explain how it could be Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, because either it doesn't say ben Beseira, that's inaccurate, or there was two Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseiras. I'm going to go through that with you. But I'm going to ask you the question, like, okay, but forget the name for a minute, which is what the Tosfos talks about. The thing that bothered me is that this teaching, almost verbatim, shows up in the name of Rabbi Eliezer. So why are we repeating the same teaching? And why do we attribute this teaching to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, especially if it's in a later generation, if in fact it's already stated in an earlier generation? I should probably stop telling you about what we're going to learn. We should probably start learning. So, ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, on the morrow, beginning on the bottom of Daf Samach Hey Amud Beis, Masechet Menachot, episode number 8 of Counting Days. As mentioned, we're trying to prove which day the counting begins on, and that is the second day of Yom Tov. So, the Gemara now says, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, Ein tzarich. We don't need this reason. Like the last episode recorded a reason of 50 days, and if 50 days doesn't begin with the second day of Yom Tov, then all of a sudden it becomes 52 days and 53 days and up to 56 days. And that wouldn't work. So it must be that we're talking about the second day of Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we don't need that. We don't need that. Harei hu Omer tisparlach. He says, you should count for you. Now this is not the verse in Leviticus 23. This is not the pasuk that we quoted copiously in our previous episode. We previously focused exclusively on Leviticus 23, Chumash Vayikra, Kapitel Chav Gimel, and we talked about verse 15, Usfartem lochem. You should count. And we talked about the idea, we learned about Shetehei Sfira L'chol Echad Ve'echad. Each and every one has to count. That's what we talked about previously. Now the Gemara says, the Torah repeats this again in the book of Deuteronomy, because of course that's what Chumash Devarim is. It's a repetition of the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu repeats the entire Torah, and why he does that is a story for a different night. But he does repeat the entire Torah. And in Parshas Re'eh, which is Deuteronomy chapter 16, we hear about many of the same things. But it's not the same syntax. And different verbiage is used. And different halachot are learned. So if you go to Deuteronomy 16, Chumash Devarim Kapitel Tezayin, and you take a look at verse 9, it says, Shiva Shavuot Tispar Loch. You're going to count 7 weeks. Count 7 weeks for you. Count 7 weeks for you. Now, I'm just going to share with you that the Sifri, which is the Medrash Halacha that accompanies the book of Deuteronomy, immediately says, Tispar Loch bivet din, by the ecclesiastical justice authority. meaning the courts have to count that. And then we say, but minayin lekol echad v'echad. How do we know everybody has to count? Here it says tisper loch. So we say, because it says in Leviticus 23, usfartem lochem lechol echad v'echad. This is basically what the Sifri, the Medrash Halacha, says in Chumash Dvarim. Now, it seems that our Gemara is citing something very similar, which is not uncommon, by the way, because the Baraisas, the codicil to the Mishnah, which some of it is preserved in the Sifri on the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, or in the Sifra on Leviticus, or in the Mechilta on Bereshit and Shemot, are oftentimes identical. Very, very often the Gemara is going to be quoting a Baraisa, which is Mishnah-era teaching, Mishna-genre teaching, it's the same kind of authority, and it's going to be quoting it from the Mechilta Sefer HaSifri, from the Medrash Halacha. Now, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's going to be quoted from something called Tosefta, which is the codicil of every Masechet, and sometimes it's going to be found in another Medrash or another Mechilta. There are other bodies of rabbinic, the teachings of our sages, Mishnah-era teachings. But oftentimes the teaching that the Gemara is going to quote is almost verbatim, if not exactly the words of the Sifri or the Sifra. And that's what's happening here. Sometimes Rashi in his commentary will quote word for word from a Sifri or a Sifra. That's not uncommon either. But let's just this is the teaching. Yehuda ben Beseir says, "Eini tzarech, I don't need this." And he says, why don't I need this? He says, because it says tisper lach. And the Gemara says, Sfira tuluya bibet din, accounting which hinges on, accounting which is dependent on, relies upon the bet din. Which is a very strange statement, because we just spent a whole episode of Gemara talking about shetahei sfira l'chol achad ve'achad, that everybody has to count individually. So what does this even mean? Rashi doesn't say anything. Rashi is like mum on this whole thing. And the drasha continues and says, so Yatzasa Shabbat Bereshit is taken out of the running as the possibility because Sefirat Ha b'chol adam, because it's counted by every single person. What does that even mean? What does it mean? What does it mean that this is counted by Bezdin? What does it mean that's counted by every single person? And why doesn't Rashi say anything? Well, I'll tell you why he doesn't say anything. Because he already said it just a page earlier. Right on Daf Samach Hey Amid Beis, the first teaching that we started with was Rabbi Eliezer. We're talking about the teacher of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, who was living at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. He essentially gives us the same teaching, almost exactly the same teaching. So if you want to know the pshat here, you have to look there. But then again, if Rabbi Eliezer taught this, why is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir teaching it? What is he teaching that Rabbi Eliezer didn't teach? Anybody who's going to say the Mishnah now becomes the master of that teaching? So if I teach you the Mishnah, now it's Mendel Omer? Like, how does that mean? How does that work? Of course, it's not the case. The teachings are attributed to the sage who embodied and espoused and preserved that teaching and conveyed that teaching. But before we go there, and we are going to go there, and we are going to try to figure out what Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir is saying, because that's part of solving this mystery. But before we go there, as I said, I'm going to point out to you that the Tosfos asks a different question. And the question that the Tosfos asks is, 1 second. We mentioned Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir literally like 10 lines earlier. We had 4 teachings, if you might remember. 4 teachings. The 4th teaching was a teaching of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir. Just before last week's episode, 2 classes ago, we talked about Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yehuda. Which Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir. I mean, this is like, it's right here in the Gemara, and this is here in the Gemara. It's literally one little teaching in between, which is attributed to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir, or will the real Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir please rise? This is very strange. And it's very strange that the Gemara would have them recorded literally on the same page. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with teachings of the Gemara, I have to tell you that it is not uncommon at all for a teaching to be found in multiple places in what we call the Shas, in the Talmud. That is very common. In fact, we have the Meseres HaShas, which is a kind of an index that's printed alongside the page of the Gemara and tells you this Gemara can be found somewhere else as well. Sometimes the same teaching will be found in the name of a different sage. Sometimes there'll be a slight variation between the way the teaching is recorded in one Masechet or the way the teaching is recorded in another Masechet. And that itself will be the cause for a conversation. Why is there a difference? Is there a nuance, perhaps, that indicates a different understanding of this teaching? Sometimes a very similar teaching will be found in the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes with the same name, sometimes with a different name. That also begs a question. Is there a difference? Is there a distinction? Is it the same? But virtually never do we have on the same page of Talmud the same teaching or the same sage speaking about the same subject in a totally different language, singing a different song. So the Tosfos is very bothered. The Tosfos says, what? What is going on over? For heaven's sake, says the Tosfos. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida says, I don't need the teaching of a Sfartim Lechem because it says Tispar Lech, and Tispar Lech is a Bezdin. We'll soon see what that means. We just had a teaching of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida just a few lines ago. You might remember it. It was just 2 weeks ago. We learned that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida said, it says Shabbos L'mayla, and it says Shabbos L'mata. It says the word Shabbat in verse 16, and it says 15 in verse Shabbat. It says Shabbat in verse 16. And by the way, we're going to hear about this teaching, a very similar teaching soon. But that's the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida. Each sage brought his own, if you will, influence to bear. This is the way they understood. This was the best way they could demonstrate the veracity of our Torah tradition. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida already made his point. He already gave his teaching. It's recorded in the Gemara. Why are we now talking about Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida? And he's singing a different song here. He's giving a different teaching. This is the question that Tosfos asks. And it's a very, very powerful question. It's a very important question. Like sometimes Tosfos will ask a question that it says, it's in this Masechet that says this. But if you go halfway across the ocean to a different Masechet, we have a teaching which seems to be somewhat contradictory. How do we reconcile these two teachings? And Tosfos will give you a number of ways of answering these teachings. Rashi will spend this time explaining to you what the Gemara says, and Tosfos will do cross-referencing and bring questions. This is like an obvious question. It's actually shocking. Rashi doesn't say anything about this. Unless, as we're going to see, Rashi may have had a different version of the Gemara, which is extremely possible. Because the Tosfos is going to say, there may be a different version of this Gemara. This business of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida may be the mistake of a copyist who was thinking about Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida, and he wrote Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida. Now, we can't just say that on our own, but Tosfos says, B'braisa d'le'el, Derish Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseida being Yenacher. He teaches something else. Says the Tosfos. Well, it's interesting. B'sefer shekosov Rabbeinu Gershom, in the book of Rabbeinu Gershom, and I'm presuming in Rabbeinu Gershom's Talmud, it said that Rabbeinu Gershom is known as Ma'or Hagola, the light of the diaspora. But Tosfos here records him as Ma'or Eine Hagola, the one who illuminated the eyes of the diaspora. Rabbeinu Gershom was the undisputed leader in what we would call Ashkenaz Torah leader. And one of the interesting things that Rabbeinu Gershom did was forbid polygamy amongst Torah Jews. But in the Sephardic world, many places persisted with polygamy afterwards because the rulings of the Ashkenazic rabbis did not apply to the Sephardic rabbis. And even up until our modern era, certain communities in Yemen still practice polygamy. And this is a discussion for a different day. Or a different year. Let me just say this. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. And somebody told me they once asked the rabbi, and the rabbi said, it is ideal. The Torah, you don't understand the Torah. I told her, no, that's not accurate. It's not correct. How do we know it's not ideal? Because Avram married Sarah. Yeah, but he married Hagar. Yeah, why did he marry Hagar? He married Hagar because he couldn't have any children. So people would practice polygamy. Avram Avinu didn't practice polygamy. He did it out of need, out of necessity, and was Sarah's way of showing the ultimate kindness to a stranger in order to obtain Hashem's bracha. Okay, so that's the only reason that Yitzchak does not marry another woman, of course. Marries Rivka. And Yaakov had no intention of marrying 4 women. He wanted to marry Rachel. It was supposed to be Yaakov and Rachel. He ends up with Leah, and you could say by mistake. Of course, there's no mistakes, and everything is divine design, and that's the way it was meant to be. And there's a lot to be said about that. And he certainly did not intend to marry Bilhah and Zilpah. So to say that polygamy is an ideal situation is not accurate, it's not correct. And most of the greatest sages did not practice polygamy. But the Torah does permit it. And why does the Torah permit it? Like I said, a subject for a totally different time. It's a different kind of class. Fine. Huh? Shlomo HaMelech was polygamous. No question about it. By the way, it didn't work very well for him. And it generally doesn't work well, period. And it didn't work well for Rabbeinu Gershom. And that's why he outlawed polygamy. Right? So for over 1,000 years, because Rabbeinu Gershom was in the 10th century, for over 1,000 years, Ashkenazi Jews have not practiced polygamy at all. At all. And in the last few centuries, it's almost not found even in the Sephardic world as well. Where would we use something like a polygamous situation? So in a very, very extraordinary set of extenuating circumstances, when a woman refuses to accept a divorce, and the husband is behaving and wants to give everything he's supposed to give, and this woman spitefully refuses to, then there's rabbinic mechanism to be able to overcome the decree of Rabbeinu Gershom. But they're really the only practical application of it in today's age. Anyway, I don't know, this is totally not. This is Rabbeinu, I'm just saying that's what he's most famous for. So the Tosfos says, in his Gemara, in the Gemara of Rabbeinu Gershom, Mochak Meha Beseira. He took off the Beseira. It just says Rabbi Yehuda. And there were multiple sages called Rabbi Yehuda. So that's not a problem then. There's Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and then there's Rabbi Yehuda. And it's not just anybody, it's Rabbeinu Gershom. So the Tosfos says, okay, so then it's not. But the thing is that most versions of the Talmud did not remove Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Most versions of the Talmud did have Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. And if we are to say that the copyist was like, he was out to lunch, he should have had another coffee that day, and he just wrote Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira in an unthinking way, was there one copyist? There was one version of the Talmud. The Talmud was copied by hundreds of people at the same time. At least hundreds of people at the same time. Everybody made the same mistake. It's not credible. It's not credible. It really isn't credible. I mean, like, the Rabbeinu Gershom erased Ben Beseira, so for us that's credible, but it's really not so credible. So Tosfos is not so happy with this. And he says that the truth is, Shema, it's extremely possible that Shnayim Hayu, that there were two different people. These are two people, lived in different times, and the fact that they had the same name, well, sometimes Jews have the same name. It's not unheard of. I have a son whose name is Zev, the son of Menachem Mendel. I have a nephew whose name is Zev ben Menachem Mendel. I have another nephew whose name was Zev ben Menachem Mendel. I ended with more nephews named Zev ben Menachem Mendel because my wife's grandfather was Zev, and there's a lot of Menachem Mendels in the family. So any Menachem Mendel who has a Zev is going to have a Zev ben Menachem Mendel. And when they're in the same shul, like when a family simcha together, you know how they get called up to the Torah? 3 generations. Because otherwise, how do you know who it is? It's not unheard of. We should have a Rebbe Yehuda ben Beseira. Yehuda was an extremely popular and common name. And Beseira is not a common name today, but it once was. It once was. So he says maybe there's 2 Rebbe Yehuda ben Beseiras. And it's funny, the Tosfos says the word Shema. Shema doesn't mean maybe there was 2 Rebbe Yehuda ben Beseiras. It's almost certain. It's almost certain there was 2 Rebbe Yehuda ben Beseiras, but what the Tosfos is saying, maybe the fact that there are 2 separate teachings recorded for the same teacher is because it's not the same teacher. It's not the same teacher. It's a different person. How do we know this? Where did you get? Because we know there was a Yehuda ben Beseira who lived in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. How do we know he lived in the time of the Beis HaMikdash? Because we have a story in the Gemara about it. A fellow came to Yehuda ben Beseira, and he was living far, far away. And he said to him, "You Jews think you're so smart." He says, every year I go to Jerusalem, I tell everybody I'm Jewish, and they don't know the difference. And I'm part of the Paschal offering. And Yehuda ben Beseira said, "You think they don't know? They know." He says, No, they don't. I tell them I'm Jewish, they don't. I speak Yiddish. He said, I know how to do this. Yehuda ben Beseira said, "Did they ever give you the fat tail of the sheep to eat? Ever give you the aliyah?" And he said, "No." He said, because they have to be Jewish to eat the fat tail. When you go, next time you say, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira said, I refuse to take anything but the fat tail. You'll see. The guy said, listen, I got my alibi like airtight. I'll show you. So he shows up in Jerusalem the next year. Obviously, he's a Beis HaMikdash, right? It's Korban Pesach. And he says, I met some rabbi named Yehuda, and he said, I have to have the fat tail. And they're like, what? Rabbi Yehuda said, he says, yes. He said, I have to insist. So listen, I really appreciate your accepting me, but I want this year I want to eat the fat tail. Now the fat tail doesn't get eaten. The aliyah gets burned in the mizbeach. And they knew if Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira said he must eat the aliyah, they said, really? Forgot to ask you, where did you have your bar mitzvah? I don't know, whatever the questions they asked him, and they found that he wasn't Jewish. And then the Gemara says, a famous Gemara Pesachim says, Yehuda ben Beseira is far, far away, but his net is spread. His net is spread. So it's a famous story. It's a famous story of Yehuda ben Beseira's wisdom, of how he got this guy tricked, or he got this guy caught. Reminds me of a ridiculous joke. A guy wants to go to a Jewish-only golf club, but he's not Jewish. His friend says, just telling me Jewish. Nobody knows the difference. He says, what do they ask you want to do for a living? He says, you make taluses. He says, taluses? Yeah, the shawls. All right, fine. He goes to the thing, and he says, he's playing golf. You're a Jew? Of course I'm Jewish. I'm so Jewish. I make taluses. You see, you make taluses? Wow. He says, wow. Can I ask you a question? He says, I never really understood how they got like the measure. He says, I only make the sleeves. I don't know. Anyway, what does that story tell you? What does that story tell you? Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira lived at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. That's a Gemara in Maseches Pesachim right in the beginning. However, there is another Gemara, and this is about the sages whose name were Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua live after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And they had an issue where there was a rabbi named Beseira, and he had a spell. Some witch put a spell on him. Whatever that means. I don't want to go into it now, but whatever it means, there was some kind of kishuf, some kind of witchcraft, and this rabbi Beseira couldn't have children. So Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua deal with the spell. They crack the spell, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Beseira has a son, and he becomes a great rabbi, and his name is Yehuda. Now we know that Rabbi Yeshua lives after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. We know this because he was a protagonist of Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Gamliel is the Nasi after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was there at the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yeshua is the next generation. And that's not even Rabbi Yehuda, that's Rabbi Yehuda's father. So Rabbi Yehuda is a generation after that, which means that there's a Yehuda who's the son of a man named Beseira, who's living 3 generations after the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. So this would be, like in Canadian parlance, this would be like mixing up Prime Minister Diefenbaker with Prime Minister MacDonald. Or for our American friends, like mixing up Roosevelt and Ulysses Grant. It doesn't work. It's 3 generations later. It's like 50, 60 years at least, maybe even 100 years. It doesn't work. So they may all be historical figures, but it doesn't work. And in fact, there were 2 President Roosevelts. It's not so uncommon. There were 2 President Bushes. I think they even had the same name. One's a junior. Okay. We don't have juniors in Hebrew. So this is not uncommon. There was a Teddy Roosevelt and there was a Franklin Roosevelt. What if they both would have been Teddy? It could be confusing. So this is the point that's being made. So it's 2 Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So Tosfos says, in such case, we have. So now, what's the only problem? The problem is, one second. If this is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who lives so much later, then why is Rabbi Yossi, who lives a generation earlier, who's friend of Rabbi Yehuda's father, why is his teaching quoted next? And the Tosfos says that's not really a question, because the Gemara is not stuck up on the chronology of when the teaching was said. It doesn't matter. It's the same era. It's the era of the Talmud. So these are Talmudic teachings. And the Gemara says if you look at the very same page that we're on, you'll see that there's teachings that are cited out of historical order. So it's not a Shavuot. So this is the Tosfos. It's a fantastic little Tosfos over here. The Tosfos, it's an unusual Tosfos, a fascinating little Tosfos. Why doesn't Rashi say anything about this? So I have a sneaky suspicion that maybe Rashi's version of the Gemara didn't say Beseira. Or maybe Rashi thought this was self-understood, that there were two Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseiras. I don't know, but Rashi doesn't say anything about it. Tosfos does say about it, and it's an open question. If you're learning the Gemara, we did it in different episodes and staggered over time, so you don't remember. But if you're learning the Gemara, if you're learning this page of Gemara straight through, you say, 1 second, I just read Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and here I am 6 lines later and getting Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira again. Who's Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira? And the answer is both. And it's not a question. So that's the Tosfos. Okay, all right, fine. So, I learned all the Tosfos, I got the Tosfos, okay, fine. What bothers me is, and Tosfos doesn't talk about this, 1 second. This is the same teaching in a different sage's name. It's literally almost verbatim the same teaching. Why would the Gemara quote verbatim the same teaching in somebody else's name on the same page? Now, it's not unheard of to have similar teachings quoted in different tractates in the name of different sages, because there were different traditions. And the Gemara had a tradition that a certain sage taught this way in his academy, and a different sage taught in that academy, and the Gemara is, by and large, an enormous amount of patchwork. So yes, there's going to be different times spanning the course of a number of centuries, and the different teachings will show up, and sometimes there were different records of who said the teaching. That's very, very common. What's not common is to have the same teaching brought on the same page twice in different names. And this Tosfos didn't answer. In fact, nobody even asked this question. So this was like, what in heaven is going on? I'm like banging my head against the wall today. And it's so similar that Rashi doesn't comment the second time around. Because why should he? He commented already. He already explained the logic previously. Or so it would seem. So you don't have the photocopy, but if you had the copy from a few classes ago, let me just read the teaching to you. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Eini Tzarech. We don't need, and he follows B'Yochanan ben Zakkai. We don't need that teaching, right? Harehu Omer, it says Tisper Loch. Tisper Loch is a reference to, as mentioned, Deuteronomy 16, verse 9. It says Shiva Shavuos Tisper Loch. Tisper Loch, Sfira Tuluya Bebed Din. A sphira, accounting, which hinges on the Bet Din. What? This is Sefirat Ha Omer. Sefirat Ha Omer is not the mitzvah of the Bet Din. Sefirat Ha Omer is the mitzvah of the people. We all know that. We just spent an hour and a half last week learning about that. What does this mean? So Rashi explains. Listen carefully. This is important. Rashi says, Tisper Loch, Mashma Loch, Tehei Mesura Hasvira. Tisper Loch means this is something you do. This is your counting. This is in your hands. This is your thing. It's not my thing. It's your thing, says God. It's your thing. Okay. So what does that mean, though? What does it mean a Sfira Hatluyu Bezin? So Rashi says, Shebeit Din Kovin Hamoadot. Who schedules the festivals? The Bet Din. Do we know with certainty which day of the week, for example, a holiday will fall out? I mean, in theory. The answer is no. Why? It depends when Rosh Chodesh will be. It depends. If Rosh Chodesh will be on the 30th day, meaning the last month had 29 days, or Rosh Chodesh will be on the 31st day, which means the month had 30 days. Why? Very simple. Because the lunar orbit, which is a whole complicated thing, the lunar orbit makes a monthly orbit of planet Earth. And it does a funny little orbit. The moon is moving in its own little orbit. It moves in little tiny orbits, and as it moves in little tiny orbits like this, around, which is why the moon is not always in the same place, and it's a whole challenging thing to know where the moon would even be, because we have this range of orbit. We have a certain circumference in which the moon operates. But in the moon's operation, so it's a band. It revolves around the Earth in a band, and it could be anywhere in that band. But it revolves around the Earth. It takes 29 days, 12 hours, and 793 chalakim. What's 793 chalakim? Simple. Take an hour every hour is divided into 1,080 chalakim. So it's like seconds. Every hour?
No, so 793 is less than.
So 793 out of 1180 is less than an hour. That is correct. That's correct. It's a little more than 50% of the next hour. So it's 12 and a half hours, and a little bit like, right? It's 29 days, 12 hours, and almost a 13th hour, a little less than half of that hour. So because of this, and then the moon essentially disappears from our view, because the moon is no longer reflecting the sun. It's lined up with the sun. So the sunlight is not seen. And of course, you'll ask me the question, well, in that case, why don't we have a solar eclipse every month? It's an excellent question. And the answer is that the orbit of the moon is elliptical, which means that it is not necessarily a perfect circle, number one. Number two, it doesn't make a perfect circle around planet Earth. Number two, the orbit of the moon and the area of the sun's operation are not necessarily lined up. You have two orbits, and think of it like an X. It's not exactly an X. They're only 5 degrees off from one another. But think of it, imagine two circles. You know what like the nuclear symbol looks like? With two circles that are like cross with each other. So you have two circles that are crossing with each other. So there's actually only 2 points of meeting where the sun and the moon meet. So it isn't common that the sun and the moon should actually be on the same level where the moon is actually going to block our sight of the sun. That's not common. By the way, the last major solar eclipse happened when? A few weeks ago. But what day was it? It was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And by the way, if you look at the calculations that we made, the molad, when the moon would intersect with, they would meet with the sun, it was exactly at the time when it was happening in Yerushalayim. Almost to the second. Exactly the time that the moon would have been reappearing in Yerushalayim. Why? Because it's very common. It is very common that there are eclipses. It's not very common that the eclipse should happen in middle of broad daylight, because in Israel they didn't have an eclipse. It was already night. And it's not so common that the sun and the moon should be at the meeting point, at that moment of conjunction. Okay, so this is why you don't see eclipses all the time. At any rate, the upshot is that the month is always going to be less than 30 days. It's always going to be less than 30 days. But it's always going to be more than 29 days. Because the moon does its thing. And it hasn't changed in the last 5,784 years. And because of this, we have a problem with Rosh Chodesh. What's the problem? The problem is that we want to see the moon reappearing on the first day of the month, but that's not so simple.
So right now it's happening or no?
Does it happen? Some months it happens. Some months it happens theoretically. The molad does not mean that there's going to be an event. You go outside in Yerushalayim, stand on your rooftop, and you're going to see the moon reappearing. In theory, this is when the moon will reappear. Now, sometimes the molad is during the high mid-afternoon. So yeah, the moon is, in theory, in a place where it should be seen, but it's the middle of the day. So nobody sees anything. And that night, you'll see a sliver of the moon, for sure.
So now it's more accurate, or back then?
You could argue that now it's more accurate, but it's not always accurate because we have a 19-year system and we're constantly adjusting. We have certain operating principles of the system. So sometimes the molad comes on one day, but Rosh Chodesh is going to be the next day anyway. The easiest rule that everybody knows is that Rosh Hashanah can't fall on Sunday, on Wednesday, and on Friday. Means what happens if the molad is on Sunday? What day is going to be Rosh Hashanah? Monday. Has to be that way. Why does it have to be that way? That's a really good question. That's for a lot of reasons.
So Passover, no?
Pesach has, yeah. Barad. Yeah, there's like a Lo Yadu Reish. Yeah. So there's all these rules. The bottom line is that every 19 years it works out. It works out. So does it work at every month? No. Did it ever work out every month perfectly? Not necessarily. Not every month. The calendar, generally speaking, works. Okay. Now here's what's really important for us to remember and to understand. And that is that Pesach, or Sukkot, is on the 15th day of the month. When is the 15th day? How do you get to the 15th day? What does it depend on? It depends when the first day is. Because the 15th day is the 15th of the first. Usually if it's 15, it's 15 to the first. If it's the 16th day from the first, it's not the 15th anymore. And if it's the 15th day from the last day of the last month, it also isn't the first. Okay. So who decides which day is Pesach? The Beis Din, the rabbis, the Jewish people. Now, when it's Pesach, it's a big sin to eat chametz. God is very, very offended if you eat chametz. And it's very, very special and wonderful to eat matzah. But what if Adar ends up with, in the time when the calendar is fluid, 30 days? Or 29 days? That'll make a world of difference. You're either eating your last chametz dessert, or your last chametz supper, or you're at the Seder. Big difference. World of difference. Oh, by the way, Yom Kippur is celebrated on the 10th day of the month. And when is that? It's 10 days from when the year starts. When is that? Great question. Incidentally, this is the reason that we used to have 2 days of Yom Tov. This is the origin of a 2-day Yom Tov, because people living in faraway places weren't getting the text messages. In those days, there was a very weak signal. The network wasn't working well. Yeah, it was called the donkey signal. It didn't work. Now we have Fido. He's very good, but the donkey wasn't so good. It didn't always work, right? So what if Jewish people lived in a faraway place? News would get there eventually, but it would take time. What if it's not a month with a holiday? Okay, then it's not a month with a holiday, no problem. But if it is a month with a holiday, we got a problem. So what did people do? They sat down and had a Seder in case it was the 15th night. And then the next night they had a Seder in case last night wasn't the 15th night. So why do we do that today? Today we know exactly when Yom Tov is going to be. And the answer is we have a custom. Once the custom was established, we maintain the custom. When there'll be a Mashiach will come, everything will go back to the way it was. So, Bezrat Hashem, speedily in our days, amen. So, the Beis Din, says Rashi, is Koveya the Moed. The Beis Din establishes the Moed. V'tzarich lishol, Eimatai chal Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach. We have to ask, so when is the first day of Pesach? Shematchel limnot hasfira mimacharat. But by the way, the 15th day is not only relevant for when we should eat matzah and tell the story, and eat maror and drink 4 cups of wine, and of course avoid chametz. You know what else it's relevant for? Another biblical mitzvah, namely, when should we start counting? So how do we know when to start counting? The day after. So whenever the 15th day was, the next day, the 16th day, is when you start counting. Excellent. Who tells me when to start counting? The Beis Din. That says the Gemara. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, it says Tisper Loch. It's a Sfirat Tluya Bebeis Din. So if it's totally Bebeis Din, if we are starting to count from the day after Shabbat, we don't have to ask the Beis Din when Shabbat is. We know when Shabbat is. As Rashi says, that the concept of Yotza, Shabbos Bereishis, says the Gemara, Shabbos Bereishis is out of the running. Shabbos Bereishis refers to the 7th day of the week. Why? Because when it comes to Shabbat Mamash, what he calls here Shabbat Mamash, why wasn't what's seen in Jerusalem? Yeah, I have a question. Somebody asked a question. Kabaike, I'm pronouncing your name right. Why wasn't what's seen in Jerusalem? Why wasn't the eclipse seen in Jerusalem? Because it was night, that's why. And solar eclipses are not visible at night, because the sun isn't visible anyway. Just like lunar eclipses are not visible during the day, if that was your question. If not, please type your question and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. The bottom line is, yes. Okay. So the bottom line is that if we would start counting on Sunday, Mimacharat Shabbat, it's a Saturday night thing. So we don't need a Bezdin. When is Saturday night live? On Saturday night. When is Mimacharat Shabbat? After Shabbat. When's that? You better ask the Bezdin. Bezdin, when is Shabbat? What's wrong with you? The seventh day of the week. Why are you asking us? That's not our schedule. That's God's schedule. Everybody knows that schedule. Understand the logic here? So it says Tisper Loch. But this is a teaching of Rabbi Eliezer. So the question is, for heaven's sake, why is this teaching now being shared with us in the name of Yehuda ben Beseira? Nobody asked this question. I'm going crazy. I'm racking my brains. I'm trying to understand this. And then there's something else which is really bothering me. Who says that Tisper Loch? Who says that means the Bezdin? Who says? Okay, it says the Tisper Loch, we have the Sifri, the Bezdin. Okay, very nice. Why? Why does it have to mean the Bezdin? So, finally it hit me that if you remember in last week's class, I shared with you a teaching about the concept of usfartem lochem. We said usfartem lochem. What does it mean usfartem lochem? It should be a sfira lekol achad v'echad. That's what the Gemara said. That was last week's class. That's not Deuteronomy. That's going to Parshat Omer, Leviticus 23. So, how do we know from Leviticus 23 that Asfartim Lochem is referring to the people? So, I shared with you then that the Rosh, in Mesechet Sukkah, no less, in Mesechet Sukkah, cross-references our Gemara in Mesechet Menachot. And the Rosh over there says, Usfartem is plural, Lashon Rabim. And because Usfartem is plural, that's how we know that we're talking about a plurality of people, many people, all counting together. Usfartem, you, all of you, you, and you. Okay, that's Usfartem. So then we had a question, which is brought down in the name of the commentaries which are attributed to the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham ben Aderet. And the question was, and of course, by the way, the teaching of Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham ben Aderet can't be asking a question on the Rosh, because the Rosh was the successor of the Rashba. So the Rosh lives after the Rashba. But the Rosh's teaching, that's why we say it's attributed to the Rashba. It may have been from a disciple of the Rashba, or a disciple's disciple of the Rashba. But for a long time it was thought that these teachings were teachings of the Rashba. And the question was, how do you know Sfartim Lochem? How do we know that it means plural? Maybe Lochem means the royal we. Maybe Sfartim Lochem means the Bezdin Lochem, you the Jewish people. How do you know? How do you know? So in these Miyuchas LaRashba, there was two answers that were given. And one answer was, because it doesn't just say Usfartem, it says Usfartem Lochem. It didn't have to say Usfartem Lochem, it just should have said Usfartem. But it said Usfartem Lochem. And here is the key. The key is that in those Chidushim, it says, take a look in Parshat Bahar. And in Parshat Bahar, which is last week's Torah portion, we read about sanctifying the 50th year, known as the Jubilee. So there are 7-year cycles in Eretz Yisrael. 6 years we work the field. On the 7th, the field lies fallow, Shemitah. And then we have 7 times 7, and it says, V'kidashtem. You're going to sanctify. So who's doing this? Everybody sanctifies their own year? No. This is a Bezdin thing. The Bezdin sanctifies. And over there in verse 8, and this is Leviticus 25, verse 8, it says, V'sofarta. Sofarta is single. It says Sofarta lecha. So here it says Usfartem lachem. And there it says V'sofarta lecha. There it's singular. V'sofarta is singular and lecha is singular. And over there, as the Sifri says, or the Sifra, pardon me, says, bebezdin. Lecha is bebezdin. So the Rashba said, aha. So when it says Usfarta Lecha, it's referring to Bezdin. Here it says Usfartim Lochem. And this was how we understood the previous teaching. So I'd like to suggest that based on that previous teaching, that we established with great clarity that the word Lecha must be talking about a Bezdin, and that's only established in the previous teaching. Now the Gemara says with renewed emphasis, aha, and this is what the Yehuda ben Beseira taught, Harei Omer Tisper Loch. Now incidentally, Rabbi Eliezer's teaching is a little longer. Tisper Loch, it says, Sfira, Hataluya, Bebezdin, Shehem Yodim, and there's a question of what exactly it's supposed to say here, but I'm going to go with the refurbished or the corrected version. It says Shehem Yodim Lekadesh. Lekadesh. They know to sanctify the Yom Tov. But over here it doesn't say that. Here it doesn't say Shehem Yodim Lekadesh. Here it just says Tisper Loch, and it says Sfira Hatluya Bebezdin. So I'm thinking to myself that now, once we have the Baraita of the Usfartim Lochem, now the Gemara is coming with a much greater clarity when it emphasizes, and this is in a later time. This is a later era, after the Baraita is recorded. After the Baraita is recorded, the Gemara says, and in view of that, the Yehuda says, Einit Tzarech. You wouldn't even, once you have that, then you have an automatic proof. You don't need the logic of the 50 days. Once you have what you just said, the Usfartim Lochem means Shetei Sfira L'Kol Echad V'Echad, so then just take it from there. It says in Deuteronomy, Tisper Loch. So since it says in Parshas Re'eh Tisper Loch, Deuteronomy it says Loch, and here it says Usfartim Lochem, once you establish Lochem as meaning each and every single one has to count, and then we have the verse which is saying V'Safarta Lecha, and Lecha, it's a contradiction. Here you have, everybody has got to count individually. Here it says you. No, it's not a contradiction. Because when do you count? When does everybody count? Everybody counts when the Bezdin told them to count. When did the Bezdin tell you to count? Whenever Rosh Chodesh was. Understand? No? A little bit? If I'm losing you, tell me where I'm losing you. The Gemara basically, based on the previous Baraita, that said Usfartim Lochem means Shetahei L'Kol Echad V'Echad, based on that Baraita. So now when there is a verse that says Tisper Lecha, I know it's not talking about Kol Echad V'Echad, but Lecha must now be talking about Bezdin. So the only way to work this out is that the Bezdin decides when you start counting. And the only way for that to be is if it's Mimacharat HaShabbat, which is not Shabbat Mamash, but rather the day of rest or cessation that takes place on the first day of Pesach. Now it makes sense. So this is why Yatsa Shabbos Bereishis. Shabbos Bereishis goes out. And now the Gemara comes along and says, another teaching. Rabbi Yossi says, Mimacharat HaShabbat. It's talking about the Macharat HaShabbat. Mimacharat HaShabbat? Mimacharat HaShabbat, is that Mimacharat Yom Tov? Is it talking about the day after the first holiday of Pesach, when you have a cessation of work? Ata Omer, or Mimacharat Yom Tov, or Einu Ela Mimacharat Shabbat Bereshit. Maybe it's talking about the seventh day of the week. Kabaike wants to know, isn't about counting the sfirot of our different levels of nefesh. There's a connection of that. That's the mystical meaning and the ethical meaning behind the counting of 7 and 7 times 7. But that's not the literal. The literal question is, when do we start counting? The Gemara is talking about when we start counting. But you're not wrong. And that's ultimately going to answer our question. So hold on to that thought. So the Gemara says, so which one is it? Is it Shabbat Mamash or is it the real Shabbat or the fake Shabbat? It is many words. Is it Yom Tov, which we kind of call Shabbat, but nobody really calls it Shabbat. Or we're talking about Shabbat Bereshit. So we say, V'chi Nemar, if you're going to tell me Macharat Shabbat, it means literally Shabbat. Which Shabbat? Which Shabbat? When do we start counting the Omer? You can tell me Shabbat Shabbatoch Pesach, the first Shabbat in Pesach. But it doesn't say that. It says the Gemara, Haloi loy nemar elo mimacharat ha-Shabbat. It doesn't say Pesach, the Shabbat of Pesach. It says Shabbat. So Chol HaShana Kula Malea Shabbatot. The whole year is filled with Shabbatot. In fact, one's coming tomorrow night. So we get lots of Shabbatot. So how do you know which Shabbat it is? Maybe we should start counting the Sefira middle of, I don't know, Shabbat Parshas Lech Lecha. Count the Sefira. Doesn't say. It says Shabbat. So Tzeu B'dok, Eze Shabbat. Go figure out now which Shabbat it is. The Torah wouldn't speak to us like that. And then he says, a similar teaching before, Va'od Nemar Shabbat Lamata, V'nemar Shabbat Lamala, which it's a similar teaching. It says Shabbat in verse 15. It says Shabbat in verse 16. Mala Haron Regel. V'tchilas Regel, just like that's referring to a holiday. In the beginning of the holiday, Afkan Regel V'tchilas Regel. And if you want to understand that better, go back to the previous episode. We talked about that in great detail 2 episodes ago. So the bottom line is that it can't refer to Shabbat. It clearly can't refer to Shabbat. But at the same time, the line of reasoning of the Gemara emphasizes again and again and again that we have an issue and a problem because which is the Shabbat? Which Shabbat are we talking about? That's the question. So you say, well, it's not really Shabbat. Well, if it's not really Shabbat, then why in heaven do we keep saying Macharat Shabbat? Why wouldn't the Torah tell us in Macharat HaChag or B'Yom HaSheni? Why would the Torah do this to us? What is the Torah trying to tell us? What is the Torah trying to convey to us by emphasizing Macharat HaShabbat? And there is no real answer in Nigla. In the exoteric parts of Torah, there is no real answer for this. There's a proof for it, but not an explanation for it. So what's going on here? Now, it's really interesting to note that the Torah talks to us about like 2 different countings. Torah talks to us about counting weeks, and the Torah talks to us about counting days. And we're going to learn soon in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Mitzvah lemimne yoyma, Mitzvah lemimne shvua. It's a mitzvah to count days, a mitzvah to count weeks. Are those 2 mitzvahs? Rambam says, no, it's not 2 mitzvahs. It's 1 mitzvah. But Rabbeinu Yerucham says it is 2 mitzvahs. So why do we make 2 brachas? Good question. There's a discussion about that. Rabbeinu Yerucham points out something very interesting. In the Sefer Adam, in the Simcha Mishi, he goes into the business of counting Sefirat Ha Omer on the second night of Pesach.
You cannot really separate them. Let's say if you want to do only 1 mitzvah, you can basically because there's only 1 bracha.
There's only 1 bracha, but the question is, if somebody counts the days of the Omer, right? According to Rabbeinu Yerucham, he did a mitzvah. So Rabbeinu Yerucham says, it's really, really interesting that whenever the Torah talks to us about counting weeks, the Torah also mentions the grain. Torah mentions the grain. So for example, let's go to Leviticus. It says, what do? It says you bring this new offering, right? Usfartem lechem mimacharat haShabbat. You start to count from the day after Shabbat. Miyom haviachem et Omer hatnufa. From the day you bring the wave offering. Sheva Shabbatot tmimot tiyena. It doesn't say count days. In the next verse, it says, Mimacharat HaShabbat HaShviyat Tispru Chamishim Yom. That's in verse 16. But in verse 15, it says count weeks after you bring the wave offering. If you take a look in Deuteronomy, once again, it says, Shiva Shavuot Tisparlach. 7 weeks. When? Mehochel Chermesh Bakama. When you take the sickle to the tall grain. Tochel lispar shiva shavuot. 7 weeks. Doesn't speak about days. So the Rambam says that this is a mitzvah that we have to count 7 days, 49 days in 7 weeks. And he says you count the weeks with the days. When you count 7 days, you say 7 days in a week. The Rambam is very clear about that. And the Rambam, by the way, also believed that this is something which is applicable, as it says in Hilchos Tamid Musafim, Perek Ches. The Rambam says that this mitzvah applies in every time and every place. It's a mitzvah al kol ish Yisrael, b'chol makom b'chol zman. And the Kesef Mishnah says, in the sheet of the Rambam, it's a biblical mitzvah. The Tosfos, right over here, which we'll learn maybe in the next episode or 2 episodes from now, says clearly that this mitzvah is It's a Sveika D'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic mitzvah in today's day and age. Why is it a rabbinic mitzvah? Did you see any korban that was brought this year on the second day of Pesach? How could you see a korban? There was no korban. Oh, if there's no korban, then it's not a mitzvah. So what kind of mitzvah is it? It's a rabbinic mitzvah. Why? It's a rabbinic mitzvah, and that's the halacha. So in Shulchan Aruch, this is actually talked about, and it's just the simplest thing is to go straight to the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, because the Alter Rebbe will make really a summation of what's brought down in the Rishonim. The Alter Rebbe in Siman Tov Pei Tes, Alter Rebbe says, Mitzvah zu noheget be'eretz, b'chutz la'aretz, and he says, b'fnei habayit, u'shelo b'fnei habayit, where there is a Beit HaMikdash, but there's not a Beit HaMikdash. Where does the Rambam get that from? He gets that, where's the Alter Rebbe take it from? He takes it from the Rambam. And you know where else he takes it from? The Ravia. Because those words, b'fnei habayit, u'shelo b'fnei habayit, are not found in the Rambam. The Rambam just says that it is a mitzvah, b'chol zman u'b'chol makom. But the Ravia says, bein b'fnei habayit, bein shelo b'fnei habayit. So that's a shita, it's an opinion of prominent Rishonim. Then the Alter Rebbe says, v'yesh she'imrim, shebezman hazeh, she'ein Beit HaMikdash kayim, there's no Beit HaMikdash in today's day and age. Ein makrivan Omer, we don't bring an Omer. Ein mitzvah zu noheget, this mitzvah does not apply midivrei Torah. Ella, midivrei sofrim, it only applies rabbinically. Where's that from? Well, it's from our Taisvus. The Taisvus here says that clearly. It's also from the commentary of the Rosh, and Masechet Pesachim, and it's the commentary of the Ran over there, and many, many others. What do we do l'pail? Alter Rebbe says that so rather, according to this shita, it was midivrei sofrim, was a rabbinic mitzvah, and it was established zecher l'mikdash, and Alter Rebbe paskins v'chein iker. This is the primary school of thought. This is the primary psak. Alter Rebbe is following the words of the Bet Yosef. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. However, he says, when the rabbis made an injunction, they made it like the Torah. So we don't make differences. Practically speaking, we count the Omer. So we have these two schools of thought, right? Rabbeinu Yerucham, fascinatingly, divides into two mitzvahs. He says counting weeks, that's rabbinic. That's a Zecher L'Mikdash. Why? Because Rabbeinu Yerucham points out, whenever it talks about the grain, it talks about counting weeks. Leviticus 23:15 talks about counting. When you bring the wave offering. Did you bring the wave offering? No, so then there's no counting of weeks. But then he says in verse 16, it says, Tisbru chamishim yom, count 50 days. That doesn't mention anything about it. It talks about you will bring a new offering. We will, Omer Hashem. And then when you go to Deuteronomy 16, Shiva Shavuot, 7 weeks. So Rabbeinu Yerucham says something incredible. Rabbeinu Yerucham says that the weeks, he says, this is only when there's a Beit HaMikdash, when their korban is brought, and he says that's why it's called Sefirat Ha Omer. And that's not a biblical mitzvah. But he says there's a mitzvah of counting days. He says that could be called Sefirat HaYamim, counting days. Counting days is not the Omer, counting days. You understand the division he wants to make? So clearly, we see something interesting about this business of Mimacharat HaShabbat, and the Rebbe explains in a Maimer, and this is the first Lag BaOmer Maimer that the Rebbe ever delivered, Lag BaOmer 1951, incredible Maimer, Sfartem Lechem Mimacharas HaShabbos. The Rebbe explains the Shita of Rabbeinu Yerucham. And the Rebbe says what Kabaike is talking about. We all know that we look in the Sefirat Ha Omer, and we have 7 weeks. They corresponds to 7 midot, and we have the first day is Chesed of Chesed, and the next day is Gevura of Chesed, and then the third day is Tiferet of Chesed, and so that goes the whole first week. Then we have a second week, and the second week is the week of Gevura. So we start off with Gevura of Chesed, and then is Gevura of Gevura, and so on and so forth. And then I want to go into what all that means, but the bottom line is that Sefirat Ha Omer is about engineering and perfecting our emotional persona, the way we relate to others, that we should be more kind, and we should be more generous, and we should be more disciplined, and we should be more respectful, and we should be competitive in a positive way, and we should be ready to shield and protect those who are vulnerable, and we should be outraged at certain things that are going on in society. These are all emotional ways we relate to things. So the Rebbe says, okay, you want to say it's a rabbinic mitzvah today, it's a rabbinic mitzvah. We don't have the koyach to engineer our personalities from the Torah, it's only, we're doing it as a zecher. We're not really the kind of people we once were. Then we have a Rambam says, no, doesn't matter. You got to do the best, you got to fix yourself. But how are we to understand the opinion of Rabbeinu Yerucham, where it's kind of rabbinic, but not really rabbinic? The Rebbe says an incredible thing. Rabbeinu Yerucham's view is that the general atmospheric change, that requires a different atmosphere. The counting of weeks, your entirety of chesed, you have to re-engineer your whole gevura, your big picture and re-engineering, so that you need a Beis HaMikdash for. However, when we're getting into the details, and we don't believe that the devil is in the details. We believe God is in the details. Our relationship with God is in the details. You can change the details. You can't change yourself. You can change the way you act. You can change the way you react. Those things you can change. And that's why Rabbeinu Yerucham says it's still rabbinic. That's still biblical. So that's one interesting point. Another point the Rebbe makes in the Maimer, the Rebbe says, what's Mimacharat HaShabbat? So the Rebbe says that in the order of creation, what we refer to as Seder Hishtalshelus. So all of creation is based on sequence. Sequence is the concept of Kedima ve'ichur. The Rebbe touches on the idea of Mati v'li Mati. I'm not even going to go into that. There's a whole Shar and Eitz Chaim on this from the Arizal. It's mentioned in Zorah 4 times. It's too complicated. Let's just stick to this idea of sequence. God first creates time. Time is comprised of sequence. You can only be in one moment at once. Whatever was, that's the past. Whatever will be, that's the future. It can only be at one time, at one moment at once. That's when we're limited to sequence. Once we have sequence in time, then the next natural, that evolves naturally into sequence in space. You can only be in one place at one time, because there's a spatial sequence. Here, not there. And that's what Seder Hishtalshelus represents. And Hishtalshelus, so that sequence, that frame of reality, is created by God. And that's called the 7 days of creation. 6 days, and Hashem endows it with the 7th day. And yes, it's true that the 7th day is higher than all the other days, but the 7th day in and of itself represents transcendence within nature. But it's still nature. And then the Rebbe says, there's a question of real transcendence. How do you get past? So my nature is that I'm either feeble or aggressive. My nature is that I'm lethargic or I'm overstimulated. It's my nature. So that's nice. Now transcend your nature. That's my nature. Well, I have to celebrate my nature. No, you don't. You have to change your nature. And that's a representation of Mimacharat HaShabbat. Macharat Shabbat means on the morrow of Shabbat or beyond Shabbat. Beyond nature. Hashem gives us a koyach to go not only beyond the work week, but even beyond the Shabbat. Sefirat Ha Omer has to happen when we tap into an energy that is beyond. Passover in general represents a leap forward, but that's a temporary thing. We have to now ground the energy of Passover. We have to absorb the energy of Passover. We have to enable it to transform us so that we're ready to receive the Torah. And that can only come on the morrow, meaning at the very edge, when you transcend nature, even Shabbat. And that's why the Torah refers to it as Macharat HaShabbat. So it sounds confusing. And on a literal level, we don't have a good answer. But on a mystical level, we have a tremendous insight, a tremendous lesson that's being conveyed to us, that the Rebbeinu Shalom, Almighty God, gives us the power and the strength to transcend. Yes, we can. We can transcend. We can experience true spiritual weightlessness. And the devil, I don't know about him, but God, he's found in the details. And once you bring this into practice, and once you ground these ideas, and of course, as Michal David's pointing out, with joy, of course with joy, everything with joy. And Simcha, the truth is, Michal David's more right than he may realize, because it says Simcha is Poretz Kol Agdarim. How do we transcend barriers? With joy. So when we serve Hashem with true joy, then we can indeed transform, not by misery and being morose, but with Simcha, we can engineer ourselves, and we can leap beyond, and when we change ourselves, that's called experiencing redemption in a microcosmic way. And that microcosmic redemption Be'ezrat Hashem, is going to lead us into the cosmic redemption with the coming of Mashiach that is going to be mimacharat HaShabbat, beyond nature, even beyond the Shabbat that we experience in today's day and age. This is the cosmic Shabbat, the era of Mashiach. May we merit that great day. B'mheira u'bi'ameinu. Amen. Thank you for joining tonight. Thank you all for joining and participating. If you're not subscribed yet, please go and subscribe right now. YouTube.com/Rabbi Mendel Kaplan, and make sure you enable notifications. And please spread and share the word, because the more we learn Torah, the more we are empowered to better ourselves. And when we better ourselves, we necessarily better and perfect the whole world, preparing it for that wonderful, blessed era of Mashiach. May it be upon us. B'mheira u'bi'ameinu, speedily, and in our days. Amen. Thank you. Laila Tov.